Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is James Wells, and it's my honor to serve as the technical advisor to the Exide Community Advisory Group. And I want to thank you for the invitation to appear here today. I'm a geologist, professional geologist registered in the state of California. I have bachelor's, master's, PhD degrees in geology. I've spent the last 25 years working on contaminated soil and groundwater at sites all across the state and the nation. And I think what I would suggest to you is that the root cause of much of the confusion about how this project is being handled is that different parts of the overall cleanup process are being regulated under different regulatory programs, as we heard about earlier today. RCRA closure, RCRA corrective action, and even CERCLA. Now, as Jane mentioned, the closure plan and the draft EIR are focused almost entirely on RCRA closure, which is all about safely removing the structures, and in particular the hazardous waste management units of the site. But it's not about a holistic cleanup of the whole site. The cleanup of even the on-site soil and groundwater is managed separately under this corrective action program that we also heard about earlier. The closure plan discusses how to decommission, I think there's 103 hazardous waste management units at Exide, and the draft EIR identified alternatives that really only vary very slightly from Exide's proposed projects. For example, one issue that we've heard about earlier is the issue of the lead in the kettles at this site. And this is really important, but to put it into perspective, removing the lead from the kettles is projected to represent less than 1% of the projected cost of this cleanup. So what does it mean that the draft EIR focuses almost exclusively on the kettles and a couple other things, and finds no need to propose alternatives to the vast majority of the project? And upon reflection, I don't actually think this is a deficiency. I think the answer is that compared to the off-site soil cleanup out in the residential neighborhoods, and compared to the more complete cleanup of soil and groundwater on-site, the closure part of this project probably should be the least controversial part. We know how to test materials. We know how to protect workers. We know how to dismantle hazardous facilities. However, I do truly believe that one of our fundamental responsibilities is to do no more harm. So the closure activities must not impose a further contaminant burden on the community. This points to one of the real challenges for the closure project, and maybe one of the greatest challenges, which is to simply ensure compliance with the written plan. It requires constant vigilance during closure for dust suppression, truck loading, truck washing, transportation routes. These are all things that could allow more lead to escape into the neighborhood if they're not managed properly. Now, I've talked about the need for a holistic cleanup approach, and I will note that the draft EIR only covers the closure part of this project, not the corrective action. And there's a tacit acknowledgement that there will still be significant soil and groundwater contamination remaining at the site after the closure project is completed. For example, there will be releases to groundwater from a part of the site that's called the Old Slag Landfill. That will continue essentially unabated even after successful closure, because that's part of the project that's destined for addressing under corrective action. So it's really baffling to lay readers when they read that one of the goals of the closure plan is to control, minimize, or eliminate post-closure escape of hazardous waste, when this seems not really to be the goal of the closure process, but rather that goal is deferred until a later date, until the completion of corrective action. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I won't say too much about RCRA corrective action, except to acknowledge that it is a lengthy and methodical process. There are really 7 fundamental steps in this corrective action process that go from characterizing the site to figuring out how it needs to get cleaned up to actually implementing the cleanup. And the corrective action process for this site was launched in 2002. And to this day, 14 years later, Exide and DTSC are still working their way through the second and third of these 7 steps. So this process is taking too long. But sadly, it's not particularly unusual. I think the rules governing corrective action were not really intended to be efficient. They were intended to be thorough. But in my experience, this timeline can be made much more sluggish if the responsible party chooses to go slow. It's a very expensive undertaking, and some, but certainly not all, responsible parties, they figure out how to manage this process by being just cooperative enough, but not too cooperative. And this can really, in my experience, slow down the inevitable give and take of the regulatory process down to a crawl. I think there's considerable discomfort in the community regarding DTSC's distinction between closure and corrective action at this site. It doesn't make sense to lay people. And among other things, there are members of the advisory group that are concerned that the lack of a single comprehensive plan for restoring the site and the off-site contamination could leave this project with inadequate funding from Exide to accomplish this really, really very large task. This dilemma is really particularly problematic with respect to soil contamination, because that's where these two problems or programs overlap. For example, if I could draw your attention to the map that's attached to my testimony, the western yard of the Exide facility would barely be touched during RCRA closure. However, this is the location of the old slag landfill. This area includes between 60,000 and 80,000 cubic yards of industrial waste, as well as an acid dump pit. This is a portion of the site that would be deferred until corrective action. It wouldn't really be touched during the closure process. Now, thinking about soil, as we've heard earlier, the closure plan calls for removing the top 5 feet of soil from spots that are directly under the structures being removed, but only if that contamination is so bad as to qualify the soil as a hazardous waste. The hazardous waste threshold for lead in soil is 1,000 parts per million, but the health-based cleanup standard is far lower than that. So this is an example that the closure plan does not represent a holistic cleanup of the site itself. I think in summary, the closure process is very important. Obviously, it's a very important part of the overall cleanup and restoration of this facility and the surrounding neighborhoods. But the way it deals with contaminated soil is just inefficient, possibly counterproductive. if we have to straddle these two regulatory programs of closure and corrective action, which we probably do, we should make sure we use them logically and efficiently. The closure process should be used to safely dismantle and remove the built infrastructure. The corrective action process should be used to manage all aspects of soil and groundwater cleanup. Right now, the soil cleanup gets kind of stuck in between the two. Now, in closing, a few thoughts on questions that were raised earlier about how can we avoid this kind of thing in the future. And I think in my experience anecdotally, with regard to contaminated sites, DTSC and the regional board as well, they're generally reactive agencies. They're organized to respond to problems that are brought to them, but they seem not to be as good at proactively uncovering hidden environmental problems. And I think one reason for this is that these problems, they don't announce themselves. They're hidden in plain sight. The contaminated soil that we've been talking about today that's out in the homes and the businesses surrounding Exide, it's generally not discernible to the naked eye, and yet it's still dangerous. We see the same thing with groundwater contamination. We see the same thing with things like vapor intrusion. Now, the problem at Exide was knowable many years ago, but collectively we failed to recognize the severity of it. Exide conducted on-site soil sampling, or the operator in the 1980s conducted on-site soil sampling, and they discovered lead in the soil at that time that was much higher than hazardous waste criteria. DTSC oversaw soil sampling in 1994 in areas immediately adjacent to Exide. They found elevated levels of lead back then. We've known for a long time that emissions from this site, air emissions, were potentially problematic. As a matter of fact, the dust that was collected by Exide from its air pollution control equipment was so rich in lead that they just resmelted it. So AQMD published plume dispersion models a few years ago showing the impacts in the neighborhood, but the levels didn't look all that bad considering the operation of modern air pollution control systems at the facility. But it seems like none of us looked at those air models and asked, well, what would those numbers have looked like before the control equipment was installed? Because this facility had been operating since the 20s. At least as early as 2001, there's published literature raising concerns about the impacts of secondary lead smelters on surrounding neighborhoods. Shortly thereafter, US EPA began a comprehensive evaluation of secondary lead smelters all over the country. So problems from secondary lead smelters, they were on our radar in the environmental community.
And please wrap up, please.
Okay, I will.
We have one more panel.
We need programs at DTSC where scientists and engineers are empowered to connect the dots at sites like this, to proactively identify problems like Exide quicker than we're able to identify them today. And with that, I'll say thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one more speaker on this panel. If you could keep yours succinct, because you spoke previously, please.
Yeah, I'm going to keep it pretty short. Again, I'm Mark Lopez with East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice. I wanted to make sure to acknowledge that, I'm wearing a Pendleton, and that might make me look a little bit like a cholo, but the real criminals on the east side of Los Angeles are the folks representing Exide on the panel earlier. It was outstanding to hear what they were saying.
If you could please focus your comments. We're talking about a closure plan, please.
Yeah, that's what I want to get to. They mentioned dealing with it with safety and environmental responsibility, which is just ridiculous when they have a criminal culture of contaminating communities across the country. And that's what Jane was trying to get to. So we're 100% against them turning the kettles back on. When they talk about being able to turn the kettles back on to reclaim some of the lead, which is really their product, they want to make money off of taking out that lead, and they say it'll be done with zero emissions. It begs the question: well, why weren't they doing that all the time? Why wasn't that the standard practice of their operations instead of contaminating our communities? So that, for us, has been a big issue when it comes to the draft environmental impact report. The threat that there will be future contamination from the kettles turning back on. So I wanted to make sure to highlight that specifically. I also wanted to highlight that our organization, our members have been doing door knocking on hundreds of doors in the impacted areas. And, as I said earlier, there's no real answer as to when homes are going to get cleaned up. And I think to a certain extent, it feels like the site cleanup is holding up the process for getting to the residential cleanup. And so I want to make sure that in parallel with doing the site cleanup process, that DTSC is putting together a plan, a cleanup plan, a test and cleanup plan, as if all the money was in the bank. If DTSC had all the money in the bank right now to do the sampling, to do the cleanup, what would that plan look like? And I would ask the committee here to ask DTSC to prepare that report and present it to you all at a future hearing, hopefully in Los Angeles, because they mentioned 1,500 homes, being able to test 1,500 homes this fiscal year. If the goal was 10,000 homes, is that achievable? Is it an issue of time, or is it an issue of money? It seemed like 1,500 was achievable with the given budget. I also want to ask the committee to investigate how we could get state funds, whether it's through a bill, some appropriations, a battery fee, some of the greenhouse gas reduction funds, maybe borrowing those and having them paid back by Exide. And so we'd also like a plan from DTSC as to how they plan to get funds from Exide. I understand some of this might involve legal action. So if it has to be presented to you on some sort of closed session, I would just like to know that the plan is being created and folks who represent our communities, folks who represent communities across the state, are looking at this plan and are advising this plan. I also wanted to see if it was possible to submit the tape to the draft EIR process as a comment, or if some sort of transcript could be submitted, because I think a lot of folks have already spoken, more will speak, and it might be valuable for the draft EIR for the site closure. And then I also want to ask, especially the folks who are representing our area, not to endorse a gubernatorial candidate in the coming election unless they publicly commit to addressing this issue, because we know it's going to take years to address. So just want to throw that out there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Next, I want to invite the last panel, and again, most of our community members left because we went on kind of long. That's why I was always cognizant of the limits that we try to ask our speakers to abide by. Next, we'll call forward our last panel on lead testing and residential cleanup efforts in the communities around the Exide facility. So I want to invite up Corina Macias, Mayor of Huntington Park, Eduardo de la Riva, Council Member of City of Maywood, Monsignor John Moreta of Resurrection Church, and then I think we have some representatives of DTSC and Exide as well. The committee understands that the lead testing and residential cleanup is not a component of the closure plan, but albeit unrelated to the closure document, the committee will be interested in hearing about those efforts and the status of and funding for remediation and cleanup efforts. And if you all could share with us your perspective on the magnitude of the cleanup efforts and the proposed solutions to clean up the surrounding communities and fully fund the cleanup. And whoever could begin, our first witness.
Well, good evening, Honorable Chair and members. First, I'd like to thank you for having this meeting and for the invitation to address you today. My name is Corina Macias. I'm the current mayor of the city of Huntington Park. This is certainly a topic of great importance, not only for me as a resident of Huntington Park, but as mayor and council member of the city. I have been attending the several meetings since 2013 where Exide was continuing to their efforts to remain open. Since then, it has been an ongoing discussion of the responsibilities that each of these agencies holds in regards to this matter. In my interaction with the community since 2013, many are frustrated, as you yourself have heard today, with the whole process. They don't see a clear financial or full commitment from neither of the agencies to do the cleanup that desperately needs to happen. There's some people that have stopped attending the meetings because they're tired of hearing the repeated presentations of the complexities of the issue. Most of the residents, the community knows that this situation is complex, but what they would like to hear is a clear direction as to what steps each agency will be taking to fix it, including the state. Funding is one. Obviously, we've talked about that today. DTSC needs more funding in order to address their own findings, that the severity of the condemnation is actually more larger than what they thought. Something that the community in the Southeast LA region and Boyle Heights has been saying for many years. Residents of Huntington Park and Maywood and many other of these communities have received the short end of the stick on the environmental justice. As public servants, we're beholden to our constituency, to their concerns, to their worries. I've heard them all. The concerns and the worries not only include Exide, but the agencies that failed to protect them for 33 years. As Supervisor Solis rightfully mentioned today, this is a very urgent matter for our community. People no longer can wait anymore. They've been waiting for too long. My urge to you today is that you not only appropriate the funding, but really consider an independent investigation of DTSC and find out what exactly happened that led us to the situation that we are here today, so it doesn't happen again. I do have letters from Community Superior Environment, which is an organization in my community of members that are composed of members that live within these areas where Exide has been contaminated, and I would like to provide them for the committee for your review. These letters ask for an independent investigation of DTSC. Thank you.
We thank you, and if you could please express to your constituents in Huntington Park that this committee will review those letters and that their voices, even though they couldn't be here, I know many of them work and can't travel a long distance, but we take those voices certainly to account in this committee.
Thank you. Yeah, they had to leave because their bus leaves at 5 p.m.
I understand that, and I do apologize, but we had a lot of important information, but I was cognizant that they were trying to express their voices too at the end of this hearing. And if you could just pass those comments to our sergeants back there, and they'll make sure to give them to our committee staff. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Eddie De La Riva. I am a council member for the city of Maywood, and I want to thank you for this opportunity given to us today to address you. Before I get into the reason why I came up here, is that I want to point out that for the longest time now, Exide had fought closure of its plant every step of the way. It wasn't up until a deal was brokered where prosecution wasn't an option that they finally agreed to close down that plant. For decades, they were allowed to pollute our communities. You heard today comments made from Exide where they are trying to shift the blame and point at other sources. Assemblymember Santiago touched on briefly the differences that we see in our communities and other parts of our country. And I can't help to think about, and I'm not trying to downplay anyone's experiences, but when you see things happening in locations like Porter Ranch, the immediate response, I think of the city of Irwindale, where residents were up in arms over the order emanating from the Sriracha plant. The Sriracha plant was closed down. Immediately, action was taken. Then I think of communities like Flint, Michigan, where residents are being poisoned with their drinking water, with water. And then I think of communities like Maywood. And what do we have in common with Flint, Michigan? Low-income, minority communities. It's unfair to our communities. It's unfair to our people. We all deserve the right to live a healthy life. Although I applaud and I thank DTSC for the steps they are taking now to remediate these problems. The damage has been done, the extent of which we may never fully comprehend. I'm not here to point fingers. We know the damage has been done. We know who's at fault. We must move forward and see what we can do to clean up this mess as soon and as fast as possible. We owe it to our residents. We owe it to our communities. I was asked to come up to provide some feedback regarding the cleanup that is ongoing in our city. And although I can't speak to what's been going on in the other communities, I can only speak to what's been going on in Maywood. And the feedback has been mostly positive from our residents who have had their yards remediated. However, when I speak to them, I come to understand that they haven't been fully given or aren't comprehending their options that they are entitled to. So I'd like to see more work done from DTSC to better and fully explain all of our options to our residents. And I know you'll hear from Ms. Mascareñas in a bit, and she briefed me earlier today, and I'm glad that there is some work being done now to better communicate with our residents. But we must act now, and I fully support the comments that were made earlier by Supervisor Solis. Thank you once again for this opportunity.
And council members, I want to thank you for coming here and being a voice for the local community. We all know here in Sacramento we could only do so much, but you're on the ground, you're on the front lines, working with environmental justice groups and the community residents. And certainly it's been expressed to me by our next speaker-elect that this is a top priority for him. He's very cognizant. He couldn't be here today, but he certainly, of course, represents that area as well. And I think it's going to be helpful having somebody in his role being able to hopefully move things along quicker, and along with Council Assembly members Garcia and Santiago. So I look forward to being part of that effort and supporting you and moving things as fast as we can. We have a next speaker.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Monsignor John Moretta. I'm the pastor of Resurrection Church for 32 years in Boyle Heights. When I heard the Assemblywoman Garcia speak, I really wanted to go home because she summarized all my remarks. She summarized the remarks of the community. She's from the barrio right here. She knows what she is talking about because she lives it. This is not Porter Ranch. This is a community that is automatically considered a toxic area. It's automatically considered a environmental justice zone declared by the EPA because of the amount of so much pollution. You just heard Jane Williams talk about the trail of Exide. They vacate, they hit and run, they vacate, and we're victims of their vacating of the premises. When the gentleman from Exide said they were going to go down 5 feet, and they were going to clear it to 5 feet, the geologists from the DTSC have told us that it's down to 45 feet. Is lead? They still have lead down to 45. That's 4.5 stories. There's lead down there. So we are victims of that. We've been thinking that maybe we should call ourselves Boyle Heights Ranch. Maybe we'll get more attention. And but I want to thank you. Everything I was going to say has already been said, and it's late in the day. But I just want to congratulate the committee because I think that your initiative on this is very, very important. If you consider there's 1,000 homes that are 1,000 parts per million, more than 1,000 parts. If they only clean 3 at the maximum, they clean 3 a week. That's 7 years only to clean 1,000 homes. That's not acceptable. I don't care what formula they use, how many streets they go down. You cannot have people that cannot play in the dirt. They cannot touch the dirt. The pregnant women cannot walk in the dirt. They cannot eat fruit that touches the dirt. And that's the protocol we have been living in for these last couple of years. It's just not right. It wouldn't happen in Porter Ranch. It shouldn't happen in Boyle Heights. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Monsignor Moretta. Thank you for being here, and also on behalf of your congregation, and thank you for your work. We have a few more speakers.
Mr. Chairman, committee and guests, again, thank you. I'm just going to give you a little bit of framework for what's being done for the cleanup. And then I have Ray Leclerc, who's got some additional details on the residential cleanup, and Ana Mascareñas. Ray Leclerc is a division chief in our cleanup program at DTSC, and then Ana Mascareñas, who is my assistant director for environmental justice, is going to talk a little bit about some of the things we're doing to better serve the community and the way we're working with them through this process. DTSC ordered Exide to begin testing residential properties in 2013 in response to air emissions analyses that were done for the South Coast Air Quality Management District. The testing focused on two areas, one in the north in Boyle Heights and one in the south in Maywood. And both of those areas were selected based on the results of that air modeling. From the testing, we identified 219 properties to further investigate in what we referred to as the initial assessment areas. Again, these were in Boyle Heights and Maywood. And in November of 2014, DTSC issued an order to Exide that was accepted by the bankruptcy court for the testing and cleaning up of those properties. At this time, 186 have been cleaned up. There were 25 that did not give us access agreements to enter the property, and then there were some more that declined cleanup, even though they had originally authorized it, and some did not require any cleanup. We have escalated pressure on the property owners that didn't provide any access to try to make sure we get out there and get those properties tested and remediated if they need it. Based on the results of that initial testing, DTSC ordered Exide to determine the extent of its contamination by testing soils in an expanded area, stepping out in a grid from the initial assessment areas. That testing began in September of 2014 and was completed last April. A total of 146 residential properties were tested, and the results were shared with the public in early May. To fill out the assessment of the extent of Exide's contamination, DTSC ordered Exide to conduct further testing along the dominant wind directions in medians and public rights-of-way to a distance of 4.5 miles from the facility. We evaluated data from sampling in the industrial area immediately around the facility and conducted additional sampling and analysis for other metal markers such as antimony, as the supervisor mentioned earlier, that are typical of secondary lead smelting. These analyses were completed in July of 2015, and they suggest that Exide's contamination may extend as far as 1.7 miles from the facility. A total of 19,894 samples were analyzed from 4,144 locations to come to that conclusion. The distribution of lead is in that around the facility is not a circle because it was influenced by the dominant wind patterns that were carrying the emissions from the facility. However, if you draw a circle around the facility at a distance of 1.7 miles, it encompasses about 10,000 residential properties. We do not know if all of those properties are contaminated. We will be testing them to determine whether they're contaminated and the extent of the contamination, and we're collecting data to help us, again, fingerprint the contamination so that we can hold Exide accountable. Once we've completed the testing, each property is prioritized based on the amount of contamination at the site, and that's how we establish the order for residential cleanup. As I mentioned earlier, in August, just weeks after receiving the results showing the extent of the contamination, the administration provided DTSC with $7 million to sample up to an additional 1,500 properties in this fiscal year and to clean up the most contaminated properties that were tested in the expanded area analysis. In November, the department shared with the Exide Advisory Group a draft method for prioritizing properties and draft plans to clean up the highest priority properties in the expanded area of testing. We addressed their comments and concerns and finalized the method and the plan in December. This cleanup will cover about 50 properties, which is a very small number considering the amount that is ahead of us to do. However, these were the properties that were already identified in the expanded area testing, and it's the amount that our legal team felt we could reasonably do by making a supplemental negative declaration for cleanup based on the analysis we had done for the original 219 properties. They felt that if we tried to do more than that, we would have to do a full environmental impact analysis on the cleanup, and that would delay it, and we didn't want to delay. So we've selected 50 so we could keep working on getting cleanup done while we're doing the comprehensive plan that everybody is wanting, that Mark Lopez called on us to do. We will have that plan done with the environmental documents so that we can then continue the cleanup in a larger area with more properties being done. In November, we also shared with the advisory group the plans for the next phase of testing in what we are now referring to as the preliminary area of investigation. And that includes all of the homes that are within that 1.7-mile radius. We've also identified that area based on major streets and roads. So in some cases, the area extends outside that circle because we didn't want to leave anybody out, and we wanted the area to be clearly recognizable to everybody. Although the contractor for both the sampling and the cleanup was in place in November, residents were understandably reluctant to have construction occurring during the holiday season. We received some of the same feedback last December when the work was being done in the initial assessment areas. So the cleanup activities did not really get started until this month. We now have 411 access agreements in place, and we've completed cleanup at 5 additional properties. We're working with 2 community-based organizations to increase the signing of access agreements, and we expect to clean up all 50 of the properties that we have funding to clean up by the end of June. You're going to hear some details now about how the properties are being tested and cleaned up, as well as highlights of our enhanced efforts to engage the communities around the Exide facility. I do want to underscore, however, that we are actively developing that comprehensive cleanup plan and the associated environmental documents, and we are at the same time pursuing rigorous analysis to hold Exide accountable for their contamination.
Thank you very much.